Okay, so we have our participants rolling in. I'm going to give it about 30 seconds to allow more people to be on. That's good. In fact, we'll get started now. So, hello everyone. My name is Dexter Wimberly. I'm a senior critic at New York Academy of Art. And today we're going to have a fantastic conversation with three gallerists from different parts of the country and the world, actually, talking about their careers, talking about the art world in general, and obviously for many of the artists who are joining us today, answering some of your burning questions about the art world and galleries. Joining me today is Esther Kim Varet. She's the founder of Various Small Fires, a gallery established in 2012, locations in Los Angeles and Seoul, Korea. Various Small Fires focuses primarily on emerging and established American arts, in particular those with practices relating to social justice, climate activism, identity politics, and alternative modalities of visual art production and consumption. I'm also joined by a native Detroiter, David Klein, who graduated from the University of Michigan in 1988 with a BA in art history. He opened his eponymous gallery in 1990 in Birmingham, Michigan. At its inception, the gallery worked closely with artists associated with Ivan Carp and OK Harris Works of Art in New York City. Over time, David Klein Gallery developed its own contemporary exhibition program, which included Detroit-based artists, as well as artists with national and international reputations. I'm also joined by Monique Meloche, who founded her gallery in Chicago's West Loop in 2001, with an international roster of emerging artists working in all media. Her program has been diverse and inclusive since its inception, and they continue to be a bellwether for artistic talents who are early or under-recognized in their careers. The gallery has grown from being locally recognized as one of the best in Chicago to being respected internationally with artists and being collected by public institutions worldwide. So I want to thank the three of you for joining me today, and let's get started. So I know that starting a gallery is not easy, and there's an interesting journey that I'm sure each of you have been on and to get to the point where you are today. And I just wanted to give each of you a couple of minutes to kind of talk about what is it that compelled you to actually open a gallery, to become a gallerist? And we'll start with you, Esther.
Okay, so I actually started off as a painter. I was a painting major at Yale up until about my junior year. But all the while I had been taking art history courses and I'd been kind of on a parallel track. And I had a kind of aha moment. I think it was really when a visiting artist said that they will always be an artist because they cannot not afford to continue their studio practice. And I realized I didn't feel that way about about my own studio practice. And I realized I was much better talking about art than I was at actually making it. But that of course has continued to inform me. And I went on an art history track pretty full force. And I went to Columbia to do my PhD. I was in art history. I was a modernist and postmodernist there. And so I kind of, and I do think that both of those parts of my life informed ultimately what it would be to start and run an art gallery. I also had the kind of luxury of working at a number of New York galleries that right out of college, ranging from Pace to Friedrich Petzel to Paula Cooper to kind of much more up and coming, like smaller galleries. It was called LFL back in the day when I graduated in 2004, but Zach Foyer's gallery. And so I was able to kind of really quickly see a range of what different gallery models could be. And all the while I was doing my PhD and at Columbia, and I realized very early on that I wasn't going to be an art historian. The speed in which things moved for the tracks that art history as a profession provided for me, which was either curatorial in institutions or academic, felt too slow in its reaction, in its ability to react to shifting sociopolitical narratives in our current day. And so I really felt that the speed in which a gallery could react and the immediacy in which exhibitions could happen were something that were, as a, even, you know, as a creator, you know, thinking of the gallery context as a site of creativity was incredibly compelling. And so I opened my first space actually in New York with two other partners. I was 24. It was right before the recession and the 2008 recession, not this, you know, it's like, this is like history now.
Which recession?
Yeah, which recession? And it was an incredible opportunity just to kind of get my feet wet. And I was, of course, full-time at school at the same time. And, you know, luckily enough, we had a 15-year lease on that space. And I would probably still be at that space if things hadn't shifted and I wasn't forced to make other decisions in my life that led me to ultimately moving out to Los Angeles from New York 10 years ago and opening up a space here.
Well, thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
And we'll get back to some of the things that you mentioned later in the discussion. And David, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. I started really young, just like Esther. I opened up, I beat you by a year, Esther. I opened at 23, my first gallery in Birmingham, Michigan. I had gotten to know some dealers who came to visit us at University of Michigan and subsequent trips to New York. I got to know Ivan Carp very well, who was Leo Castelli's director in the 1960s and was kind of a wonderful, generous, honest art dealer and a great place to start for me. So we opened in 1990 in a space in Birmingham. And we've always had a hybrid program where we split between primary market and secondary market. I've always enjoyed working in the secondary market, post-war American and post-war European art. And I've always enjoyed having a program with living and contemporary artists. In Detroit, where I'm from, I think it's very hard to specialize and you really need to kind of diversify a little bit and be a well-rounded organization. But I had, besides Ivan, I had some great mentors growing up, you know, very generous people, Virginia Zabriskie, James Goodman, Marissa Del Rey, and the great Manny Silverman, who's been based for so many years in Los Angeles. All these people, elder statesmen, I guess at this point, you know, really helped me along and were always very generous with me. I'd go into the gallery and talk to them about my show ideas. And they generally said, here, take whatever you need to make it happen. And that always surprised me and always made me, you know, very pleased to be able to work with all these colleagues in New York. And then, you know, we really tried to focus on Detroit in terms of our contemporary program. We have a great art graduate program here at Cranbrook, the Cranbrook Academy of Art. And that's been a really wonderful resource for us in terms of finding new and interesting artists. I guess maybe the turning point for me as a young art dealer was doing a really early art hotel in Amsterdam. So I don't know if you guys remember art hotels. This was 1993, 94. It was at the Hilton, which is where John and Yoko had their had a love-in peace fest in their bed, in their hotel room. But it was a great lineup of dealers at that time. Gracie Mansion was there, Liz Corey, John Good, who's now a director, I think, at White Cube. Mary Sabatino was there with Long. There were wonderful galleries there, and that really opened my eyes even farther in terms of what a contemporary program could be. And we started to work with a lot of these people. I've always enjoyed working with other dealers. So that was another great source of finding interesting artists. And early on, we showed Terry Atkins and Squeak Carnwath. We showed Amy Silman, and from Brazil, Regina Silveira. You know, we met all these people through colleagues in New York. And when I opened up, Soho was really humming, and it was a fabulous place to visit art dealers and look at art. Later on in the 2000s, I hired a very talented gallery director named Christine Sheffman. And with her assistance, we really grew the contemporary side of things. the program, and we opened up, we found a beautiful space in 2015 in downtown Detroit, and we opened up that year. And it's been just tremendous. Having a gallery in Detroit has always been a dream of mine, and it's just been a wonderful experience. And that's, that's kind of where we are today. It's very fragile here right now, coming out of the pandemic. And I hope, Detroit has been on a really strong upward trend, but it's fragile, and I hope it continues. And I hope the gallery scene in Detroit continues to grow.
Yeah, well, I hear you. Amen to that. And Monique, how about you?
Well, I grew up, David, across the river from you in Windsor, Ontario.
I saw that. Welcome, colleague. Welcome, neighbor.
And we were also at University of Michigan at the same time. I graduated in '89, which is crazy.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
I was on like 100% art historical track. I actually went into University of Michigan pre-law, took a art history 101 elective, and completely changed my life, and phoned my father and said, like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this degree, but will you still, fund my schooling? And, he's the Cardinal King of Canada, so he didn't know anything about art. And he was just like, yeah, cool, do it. And so I graduated. I moved to Toronto, and I worked at a contemporary Canadian gallery, Winnipeg Gallery, for a year while I was applying to grad school. And eventually I made my way to Chicago to get my Master's of Art History and Theory at the School of the Art Institute. And so I moved here when I was like, I guess that was like when I was like 20, 21, 22. And I was going to grad school, but I immediately lucked out into getting like a part-time gig at the Museum of Contemporary Art here. So I was hired as an auction assistant through their registrar's department. And I ended up parlaying that 3-month position into 6 years of full-time employment. And the last 3 years, I was actually an assistant curator. And so, I visited galleries. Obviously I worked with dealers because I was working in the institution, and then I was also teaching part-time at the School of the Art Institute as well. And after 6 years of being there, I kind of reached that, the ceiling of advancement. And that's why you see curators moving from institution to institution. But I had fallen in love with Chicago, and I did not want to move. And so I kind of did a series of like informational interviews with different women in the arts in Chicago. And Rona Hoffman, who has the Rona Hoffman Gallery, which has now been around for over 40 years. She's still the queen bee here, and she's phenomenal. And I took her to lunch, and like literally I had less than a year of real gallery experience. I still didn't even know really what it was, but I convinced her that she should hire me as her director, and that I would bring like some more youth to her program, introduce her to some younger artists. And it was a good day, and she fired her director and she hired me. And so I consider Rona as being like my 2 years as her director was absolutely my PhD. And I learned so much about what to do in a gallery, what not to do in a gallery. She is a wonderfully forceful woman who is not the easiest to work for, but we still get our like monthly martinis together, so we're all cool. But so she really, that is where my training ground was. And then I came to a point where I'm just like, okay, I don't really want to work here anymore. And at that point, Kavi Gupta was just expanding his gallery, and it was then just known as Vedanta Gallery. And he was dealing with, contemporary Indian artists. He didn't really have a big contemporary program. And so I went on to be his director for 1.5 years. And immediately we started doing art fairs, and he was expanding his building. So I kind of got like the luxurious position of, not being financially responsible for a gallery, but actually having a tremendous amount of artistic control. And so once, like that 1.5 years passed and his building was done, he was like, okay, yeah, now it's time for me to step back in, and like, you can just be a consultant. I was like, no, that's not what it's going to do. And so I took a couple months off to figure out what it was going to be. And I'm like, man, this art world has like such a short memory. I gotta like either like, I gotta jump in, I gotta dive in. And so like I left him in the like the summer of 2000. And then by October of 2000, I opened the gallery in my home. And it's like a 3,500 square foot, 3-story in Ukrainian village. We did a show called Home Wrecker, and I had over 30 artists with 90 artworks everywhere. I had, like people would be sitting on their bed, watching video on our TV, and there's like installations in the closet. And after it was supposed to be up for a month, like 350 people showed up on the opening night. I had taken Rona's mailing list with me, and with her acknowledged. But like I invited 800 people, and 350 people showed up, which was incredible. And I kind of was like, yeah, this is gonna work. This has got to be real. Like the biggest collector in Chicago, Louis Manilow, who was one of the founders of the Museum of Contemporary Art. I mean, he was the first one on my doorstep at like 4:59, waiting for me to come in, and with his checkbook in hand. And so then finally by May of the following year is when I opened up in Chicago's West Loop. That was my first location. If anyone's familiar with Chicago, like at that point, it was like me and the Meatpackers. Like that was it. There were no fancy restaurants. There was no Soho House. There was no anything. And early on, I used to get the Meatpackers to come in and place stamps on our announcement cards, because I'm like, if you're just going to sit out there in your trucks and stare at us through the window, like you should at least come in and do some work for us. And so that was like my first now like 4 locations. So here we're in West Town. We just moved to our largest space that we've ever had the summer of 2018. And so we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. And it helps ground the conversation to kind of hear about your journey, for all 3 of you, in your trajectory. David, here's something interesting. So here's something you don't know. You mentioned Ivan Carp. And prior to this discussion, over the past few days, I was thinking of different ways that I could frame our conversation. And one of the things that occurred to me before even reading your bio was that I wanted to talk about my relationship with Ivan Carp. So here's someone that we have in common. Without going too far down a rabbit hole, I met Ivan Carp in the mid-90s. At OK Harris. Before I got involved in the art world, I was still running an advertising and PR agency at the time. And it was actually through my conversations with Ivan that I made the decision that I was going to enter into the art world. And I was
fantastic, wasn't he? He was having a conversation with him was heaven. It was always inspiring. So.
And Ivan was a friend of mine until he died in 2012. So I knew Ivan for about 14 years. And his wife, Marilyn. So just to kind of frame that small world, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one of the things that came out of my conversations with Ivan was about we talked a lot about the relationship between artists and their galleries. And obviously Ivan, having worked for Leo Castelli, 60 years ago at this point, 70 years ago, we're talking about mid-century.
Right. 1959, 1960, right.
Yeah, it's quite a long time ago. Obviously, the relationship between artists and galleries have changed. Some things have stayed the same, but other things have changed. And I know that of the 100 some odd people that are joining us today, many of them are artists. And I would love to hear just some brief insights from each of you about how you, sort of cultivate and manage the expectations between the gallery and artists. And not so much, like specifics around any sort of financial arrangements, but really if someone was visiting from another planet and didn't understand how galleries and artists collaborate with one another and work together, how would you explain that?
I mean, simply for me, it's always been, we're the business end of an artist's effort and practice in making work. We just can't get away from it. I think galleries can do all kinds of things, but in the end, we're a business. We're a commercial operation, and we're showing art to sell and to benefit the artists that we represent. I think that's at the core of our activity. I like to do all kinds of other things with the gallery, but that's what the artists, rely on us. That is our job, is to promote their work and to find new good homes and to allow them to have a studio practice with as little interference as possible. That's kind of how I define the relationship at its simplest level.
Esther?
I 100% agree with David on that. I think it's an important thing to remember because you are not only creating creating an ecosystem that supports you and your staff, but also the artists, and you realize that the paycheck comes from you. And so there's an incredible responsibility in that. And an incredible responsibility also of being the intermediary between the studio and the rest of the world. Often with artists that have been having studio practices for 50 years and over, we have a number of our artists are in their 70s and 80s. And so at least for me, who I'm in my mid 30s, like they've had, some of them have had their practices longer than I've been alive. And I think that there is a gravity to that. But on a kind of interpersonal level, because I do think that the function of a gallery is much more intimate than just say being a clothing store where you where you have different kinds of artists, fashion brands. I think it's much more intimate than that. And you guys have talked about Ivan Carp, and I think the best dealers, even just going back in history to the early 20th century, have always created these familial bonds with the artists that they represent, friendships that I think, I have learned over the years, different artists have different levels in which they feel they want to meddle those two things, the business and the friendship. But for me personally and my staff, we put our heart and souls into every artist we put out there. And we wear our heart on our sleeves and we expose ourselves emotionally to talk about the work and all of that stuff. And if it isn't a relationship with the artist that feeds us both ways, then it is not a sustainable relationship for us. And that also, is a level of artists turning back around and being like, saying thank you every once in a while for the efforts that we do. Because sometimes, as we know, as we all dealers know, sometimes we feel like a lot of that gets swept under the rug because we really are the engines to drive a practice in the real world. And we do it at the sacrifice of ourselves to do that for someone else. And I think it really is a selfless act to be an agent for somebody or a representative of somebody. And so I think I would say 100% of the artists that we work with today, and we work mostly with living artists, we have that relationship with where the gratitude goes both ways. And so that to me, for me at least, and again, maybe this is something that young artists, like when they, because the audience that we're talking to are young artists here, if they ever find themselves at a gallery at one point or another, to remember that it's a team, and to thank the people that are advocating for you, and to not think that you're doing it alone and it's your work alone that's making it. I think that's just something that I've really realized has factored into the process in which we choose our artists for representation. We refuse to work with artists where we don't feel that kind of mutual feedback loop with.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And and Monique, I certainly want to get your perspective on this question as well. But one thing I wanted to add in the meantime is, I get calls and emails from artists all the time at various stages of their career. Some of the most random questions you can probably imagine about all sorts of things. But regardless of the question, I generally find myself gravitating toward a certain kind of answer, because it usually is the answer that addresses most of the questions. And that answer generally is, if you're having a problem with the gallery that you're working with, perhaps there were things that you didn't address at the beginning of the relationship. And now, as things have kind of like, the horse is out of the stable or out of the gate, whatever analogy you want to use, you're finding that things have gotten complicated because you didn't ask certain questions that you should have asked perhaps earlier on in the relationship, like what happens if, and how do we deal with this partnership that we now have once things start to evolve and business starts to pick up or slow down drastically, and the artist has to sort of make changes in their life or lifestyle for financial reasons. So I totally appreciate that, the talking about the collaborative nature between an artist and the gallery, because I believe that that's a key component of it. But Monique, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything, Esther and David, that you've said. And it is a true partnership. And although we have artists at all stages in their careers at this point, when we started, and what we continue to do is we continue to, foster emerging artists. And, these are partnerships that I don't want to go into lightly, and I want to make them long-term. And, yes, the gallery provides the artist a platform to show here and to show at art fairs. And, I'm on the phone with 10 curators a day negotiating, different exhibition possibilities and, possible acquisitions. And so it's like this real long-term, long-haul lifetime attitude, right? And these are people who, we and like on our, not only do we support the artists and, the artists support us, but our artists support each other. We've had multiple artists marry each other. We've had artists, like standing up at each other's weddings. We're witnessing, the birth of their children. And, a couple years ago when Rashid Johnson got his honorary doctorate degree at the School of the Art Institute, which I quietly advocated for 10 years, it was his parents who were sitting next to me being like, thank you. Like, you worked with him for 20 years and like, you care enough that he gets this honorary degree. And so it's like, now in the past couple of years, my husband's come on and as a role of a partner now that he's retired from his real estate career. And, he's even providing financial guidance for artists to, renegotiate their mortgage and bundle in their student loans. And so we're like trying to provide this like whole comprehensive, comprehensive package that we allow. And, but I do agree, Esther, with what you're saying. It's kind of like, you have to have this relationship because like the artists are working hard to make their work and put it out there in the world. And we're working super hard to like get it out there. And, the joys of being a dealer, like you kind of want to make that magical. You don't want it like to, you don't want it to show. You want it to be effortless, right? Like everyone knows that you're still like sweeping 2 minutes before someone comes in for an opening, but like you're just cool as a cucumber. Like no one knows that like your whole shipment at your art fair didn't arrive until 20 minutes before the preview, but then it all like somehow miraculously works out. And so it is important when like everyone knows how hard each part is working. And it's super personal. And there are plenty of artists whose work I admire, but maybe we don't gel personally. And I collect, like I try to collect almost something by every artist we've shown. It's not totally possible, but it's kind of like if I can't be on board 100% and like talk about it as enthusiastically as I would the next thing, like that's just it's not the thing for me. And like that's where I think people like need to be realistic too in their gallery choices, right? Like we work very hard and we do studio visits and we talk to people and we're trying to like figure out, we listen to our artists, which is like my most pipeline to other artists is having recommendations from them. But I always like encourage artists to like realistically do their homework as well, right? Like there are certain places that fit and there are certain places that maybe are just aspirational. And so I think like those sort of things you have to kind of keep in mind.
Well, you said quite a few things that I actually want to circle back to. And one of those things has to do with the additional support that your gallery, by way of your husband's involvement now, helping the artists that you represent with other aspects of their life and career outside of the actual making of art and placing that art in collections. I think that that's a very important piece of the puzzle. Obviously, I would say that, me being who I am, and really interested and invested in how artists can have sustainable careers. But the other thing you mentioned that I think I really want to open up for the group to discuss, across the board, is how you discover other artists, right? You mentioned that, listening to the artists that you represent is one of the main ways you do that. And I've mentioned that to artists who've asked me. I said, if you want to, I won't go so far as say, if you want to be represented by a gallery, do X, Y, and Z, because far be it from me to know what that equation is. But I often say, if you want to meet the owner or director of a gallery, it is probably a good idea to know some of the artists that are represented by that gallery, right? That it's like, that's probably a good way to get an introduction if someone really thinks that you're doing great work. But I would love to hear, Esther, David, how do you go about looking for artists to represent?
Okay, David, you go first.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. I think it's, basically three areas. It's the artists we already work with, as already mentioned. It's the art schools that we visit, the grad schools we visit, not undergrad, but grad schools we visit. And, when we used to be able to travel to art fairs, for us, I'd like to say it was the ads in Art in America, but nobody advertises in Art in America so much anymore. But, it's those three venues, and obviously what our colleagues are doing outside that we're friendly with, who they're showing and who they're working with. I mean, those are kind of been the basic sources for us for finding new people to work with.
And
yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of those things that David just said. There are incredible kind of tangible ways to discover. I say tangible because I think there's also a digital component that is becoming increasingly important for us as a research tool. Obviously, I hate to say it, Instagram. If you're an artist, if you're a young artist, have an Instagram page. Do not put pictures of your dog or yourself when you were 8 years old, or artworks of even other friends, because it's really confusing. Do a professional, like think of your Instagram page as a professional page where someone will go and look at your artwork and put video content in there of how things are made, like spend some time curating that. So, and look at it and be like, okay, if somebody comes in for the first time, do they get a good sense of my practice in the first 10 seconds of looking at it? And if the answer is no, then you've got to redo your Instagram page. And so that's one way. Another way is, I made a list of actually things that, like, if I were a young artist, and most of you guys that are tuning in are, and if I had to impart some information on how to get discovered. Okay, number one, have a name that's Googleable. I know that sounds really weird, but like, if you are Jennifer Lopez, if your name is Jennifer Lopez, find a way to make your name unique so that when I Google it, I don't get pictures of J-Lo at the Super Bowl. Like, I get something else that feeds in. If your name is Jennifer Park, I would say use your Korean name. It's like, there are a lot of Jennifer Parks or Esther Kims out there. And so that, I think, is really interesting and important because, and we do this as in-house, as something for our artists, actually, is we have a person here that is staffed that really knows how to work with Wikipedia pages, that really works with us on how to kind of shape internet searches, so to optimize searches. Because that is important, because when I talk to a client about, hey, have you looked at this work? The first thing you do is either look it up on Instagram or Google it. And if nothing comes up, you're moving on. And so those two things. And then another one is, and again, not as important as the first two, having a personal website for your artwork. I would stray away from putting a personal statement like, I started painting when I was 13. Like I would stray away from that. I would try to get even a friend who's another artist to write something about your work so it feels unbiased. It doesn't feel so self-promoting. And number 4 is have your studio ready. Always have 1 or 2 finished works in your studio. I mean, I'm trying to feed very practical practical answers for the audience on things that I know that they can do. Which is, even if you're selling you're doing great in the world and successful and you're selling works left and right and there's no inventory, always hold back 1 or 2 things to keep in the studio, because there will be a time when a curator is in town and wants to visit your studio, or an art dealer is in town, or someone is interested and wants to come by. You want to be able to show them something, not just a piece of paper where you just started yesterday. It's like
that's so good, Esther. I just want to chime in because you're reading. You've been reading my notes. I mean, I am just a huge believer that if you want opportunities, you have to be ready for them. And I always tell artists that you need to be prepared every single day to respond favorably to an opportunity. You don't need to start writing your statement when you hear about a residency. You need to already have it. You don't need to start, making a painting when you hear about an exhibition opportunity. You should have something ready to go. And to your point, studio visits. So David, I don't want to skip you because I'm still interested in hearing your take on this question about how do you find artists, but I also want to take a moment to address some of the questions that have come in, because we're getting close to that 40-minute mark, and I know there are going to be more questions as soon as I get through these. So I guess first thing first, David, how do you go about finding artists?
Right. No, I did get a chance to contribute. I think Monique didn't get a chance to contribute. So I'm going to give my 2 minutes to Monique. Go ahead, Monique. Thank you.
The gentleman from Michigan yields to you.
Yes.
I mean, look, Chicago has an incredible amount of art schools here. So, I mean, not taking advantage of that is just ridiculous. And, like early on, I was only showing local artists because I couldn't afford shipping and I couldn't, it was just practical. But, then there were many, many years where artists would move away from Chicago. And now we're finding more artists are actually moving to Chicago, which is really excellent. So yes, I do go to MFA shows quite consistently. And when my artists were in school too, it's like Rashid Johnson was in school with Justin Cooper, whose work is right behind me right now. And he's the one who's like, hey, there's this cat doing these like weird performance drawing sculpture things. I have no idea what he's doing, but I think you would dig it. And so and now it's 15 years later. There's no guidebook, there's no rules, there's no, it's like, you stumble across something on Instagram. Like I'm constantly following like a lot of my collectors as well, because they've got a ton more time on their hands than I do. And so I'm like finding Instagram discoveries through them as well. And, but it's just constantly looking. And, when we were traveling, it's like whatever city that I was in, I would try to set up some studio visits. Now it's even more so much more easier, even though it's like annoying that we're always on Zoom. But just the practicality of being able to do so many more studio visits has been really a very terrific silver lining in all this. But it's just always looking, whether I'm, I discovered somebody new before the MCA had to shut down the second time. I discovered a new local artist who I'd never even heard of her name. And now I just invited her to do a small project in our back room during our spring show. So she just said yes yesterday. So that was a nice, new development.
Well, that's great. So a few of the questions that have come in, I want to address them. So how important, in your opinion, is an MFA in terms of, for an artist to get representation? Is that something that's really important to you as you're developing your program?
I think it's very important. I think it allows for maturity. It allows for, I guess, focus. It gives you a couple of years, at least, I'm most familiar with Cranbrook, and you basically are in your studio all day, every day, making a body of work that you're going to show at the end of 2 years. And I think that can be really helpful. I also find in MFA programs, those who participate no longer make work that looks like their instructor, which I think happens a lot in BFA programs. So I would say an MFA is very, very helpful for many, many reasons beyond what I just elaborated on.
Okay. Anyone else have an opinion on that question? Sure, Esther.
And I think this is ironic because I've been in school for a really long time. Like I was doing my PhD program for 12 years. It's like I'm a big school person, but to be honest, I think it's a waste of money, the MFA program. I mean, that's totally, if you're talking about the obstacles, trying to get past obstacles to get seen and to start getting into the art conversation, I don't really know. I think I am somebody that at the end of the day, I've seen too many artists that are like in debt from their MFA programs and don't have any path out of it. And I don't think that, again, like I would encourage, I think the one thing, two things that MFA programs really provide that are great, which is a intellectual backbone. So getting familiar with the art historical canon and critical theory, right? So like the October, it's like you can, like that, you will have a structure to learn those things and to discuss those things with colleagues that are also learning them at the same time. And secondly, studio visits, right? So when you're in an MFA program, you can get studio visits from teachers and feedback from friends. I mean, those two things that are very hard to replicate in the real world without an MFA. But I would encourage you are still able to do those things without being an MFA, right? Like those books are out there, those reading lists are out there, knowledge is out there. We are liberated in the kind of post-internet, in the internet age to access anything. And you will often kind of see, there will be other students that that are at MFA programs. Ask them for a reading list, of what they're learning. Just Xerox it and start going to a library, start checking out books. And just so you are familiar with the language in which everybody's talking, because contemporary art is a language, it's a dialect, it's a language that you have to learn and in order to kind of fit in. And so those things are really important. And also create an artist community, be a part of an artist community, do studio visits with each other frequently, get support that way. So you don't feel like you're doing it alone, so that by the time you do get your first show, group show or solo show from a gallery and you get a consignment sent to you, you know what to do with it. You share it with other friends that have gotten consignments in the past and you guys compare notes. And, I think there are very pragmatic things that you can start developing now without an MFA that will prepare you for the market. And again, if you don't care about, and I have to say, I don't really go to MFA programs anymore. Like I used to, and I will say that's I don't. I find like even the MFA shows that, they have the big ones at the very end, kind of clumsy, because it's so, I think, again, for me, it's about the speed in which there's so much information out there. There's so many artists out there. There's so many things to see, at least for me, because I also, and again, I think it depends on the program. Like for me, I am always on the search for an under-recognized historical artist. I mean, we have a show up right now, Clarence Holbrook Carter, who's an American surrealist, and he is no longer living. Like, and so I think for me, it's like, it's a little bit of that kind of hybrid exercise of seeing what's happening, where chatter's coming from in the world, and who is able to create that chatter. And I think Monique kind of also hit the nail on the head. You ask collectors, because collectors are followers of chatter, and they can do a lot of that legwork for you, because you're like, and you have 5 collectors that are on your texting chain, and they're like, hey, like, and they're asking you your opinion, and you're asking them, and I'm looking, you know, it's like, and it's a kind of constant movement. And also, you know, I have my staff, I have 3 directors that work for me, and their primary kind of function is to A, maintain our current artist relationships, and B, expand artist relationships, and to look. And so, and they're intergenerational. So I'm not saying that my strategy is the same as anybody else's strategy, but like, sorry, this is not answering your MFA question anymore.
Well, I mean, I appreciate your opinions on that, and I think, I mean, I think that there's definitely pros and cons. I mean, as with anything, I mean, to say that is almost to say nothing. But I think that it's a choice, and I think that given how you've described your gallery's program, I can understand why the MFA isn't necessarily high on your priorities in terms of how you're developing your gallery's program. And so I understand it. But Monique, I also want to give you a moment to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the costs of an MFA are ridiculous, and you know, who knows what's going to happen now? Like, given the fact that like people are you know, everything is virtual right now, and like, how do you actually teach a studio practice virtually? Like, it's, you know, people are struggling right now in their MFAs. So we may, you know, we might see a shift. I still feel it's quite valuable, because I've just seen it time and time again, that it gives the extra buffer of 2 years for you to get your shit together, and to, like, you know, get your own voice really, you know, like, where the art world is becoming a little bit too much like that, like the NBA. And I'm feeling like, you know, people are going to start going to the high schools, and, you know, it's like, there's a lot of too quick happening for people too young. And like, you're just seeing, it's like this, it blows up and then it goes away, because they don't even know how to sustain it. And yeah.
So let's talk about that as we're coming close to the final like 12 minutes here. So there's still a lot of things I want to cover. So you mentioned, you know, the fact that, or the possibility that, because of the way the art world is always like seeking out the new, there's this propensity to start going younger and younger and younger. And there's some drawbacks to that. So if you have an opinion on this, and I'd love to hear from each of you, can we talk a little bit about like how an artist can consider pacing themselves? Let's say you're a young artist experiencing a tremendous amount of interest in your work from all sides, because of Instagram, because of other things. You know, you're in your early 20s, relatively speaking, and people are just coming at you. Obviously, I'm sure there's some people on this webinar would be like, yeah, good problem to have. But I'm just kind of curious about what kind of wisdom or insight you can give to this young artist who's being pulled in all sorts of directions with opportunities, but can't discern the difference between an opportunity and a potential hazard.
I think I mean, it's there again, that there's no real guidebook, but I mean, and you don't want to pass up opportunities, right? And like, there's like the striking when the iron's hot, and there is something to be said for that. But I think like the biggest thing that I'm constantly telling my artists is that it is okay to say no. And you have that ability, and you should really weigh the options very, very carefully. And, you know, you rely on your network, like your you know, people who have gone there before you, who might, you know, like, you know, artists are very good at giving each other advice. I mean, there's a lot of things everybody wants to say. But I think there's like burning yourself out and just like saying yes to everything, and not letting yourself like develop. Like, you want to have that space to like not just be making work for the next solo show or the next group show or the next art fair. You want to have some space where you can be like, let's create that next body of work. And like, you know, maybe it's a, you know, there's an unexpected turn. And if you're just saying yes to everything all the time, you're not taking that time to just continue to develop your practice, because, you know, it's a shifting thing that has longevity. And, you know, there's, I just think the burnout factor is really easy to fall into.
Right. David?
Well, I going back just briefly to the MFA issue, because it's unresolved at the moment. So we're disagreeing on different aspects of it. But for me, it's just a matter of maturity. And I want to work with adults. And the MFA gives you that opportunity to grow up and to develop what Ivan Carp would call an identifiable body of work. That was one of his phrases. So I have always taken that to heart. Yes, and young artists need to be very careful, and they do need to say no. I mean, we have artists that we work with that are getting asked for things every couple of days, whether it's charity auctions, group shows, you know, it's just a variety of things. And we're always trying to tell them, be picky, let us help you to make choices, and just to take your time and be comfortable saying no to people. Absolutely. But it's difficult, because they think artists want to please, they want people to be happy, and they want their work to be disseminated as widely as possible. And sometimes that's not necessarily a good thing. And I think that's what a good art dealer, a good gallerist can help you make those good decisions.
And can we talk about things on the other end of the spectrum? So clearly there are a lot of artists who are over 50, perhaps over 60, who are still developing certain aspects of their career, and they're curious about what they can do to remain competitive, or to even be seen and heard as an older artist. I mean, Esther, you mentioned that there are artists that you represent that are older and have been practicing as long as you've been alive, or longer. But what would you say, what are some of the things that an older artist can do now to move their career forward? And perhaps it's the same advice that you would give to a younger artist, but I'm curious.
I don't know if it would be exactly the same, because if like an 86-year-old had an Instagram page, I'd be like really weirded out by that. I'd be like, which grandchild did you force to do this? But I would say right now about almost half our artists are over the age of 60. And I think for those artists that we end up working with, not all of them have been completely under the radar, right? Like they've been showing here and there. It just hasn't been the kind of intensity as they're experiencing now in their late careers. And a lot of that has come through the word of mouth thing is really important from other artists. Like I think of, for example, Jessie Homer French, who's an artist that like we started showing a couple of years. We did like a breakout presentation at Art Basel Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and nobody had heard of her. It was like she'd been painting for 50 plus years in her studio in the mountains of Palm Desert. Came through an introduction through Billy Al Bankston, who's like an old, he's like an old school artist who's also an artist in our program. And she, experienced this big kind of, now she's also represented by Massimo De Carlo in Europe, and is having her first solo show there. And, I think for her, and this is what I've told her, because she's like, there are all these people trying to get in contact with me. She's like, I don't even really use email or the phone. Like, I don't understand like how, and I'm like, listen, like we are on your team. We're a teammate, pass the soccer ball to us and we'll dribble it in. Like, it's like, don't let it burden or disrupt what you've been doing all along, because at one point or another, and I guess this is something that I will also say to younger artists, is that, and maybe tying in with this idea of trends, is that it will not always be your time. And you have to be okay with that. the art world goes in very fast trends. So at one point or another, whatever you're doing, it will be trendy. If it's not trendy today, it will be trendy in 5 years. You know, it's like it moves so fast. And I think it's also important to address that with this audience, because I know that the New York Academy of Arts is so heavy on figuration, right? And it's been a golden age of figuration that we've been in. And we are now kind of slipping into another era, and starting to, where abstraction is going to be important again, photography is going to be important again, and all of these things. And I guess my advice to a young artist is A, keep true to yourself, as corny as that sounds, because your work isn't gonna look good if you're trying to imitate somebody else. That's gonna look so weird and obvious. And secondly, don't get discouraged, because again, like, we work with artists that have never had the light, you know, their works have never seen the light of day for 50 years. And now they're the works are flourishing in the marketplace and in curatorial eyes and in museum institutions. So, but to a young artist that's experiencing a lot of heat right now, a lot of demand, which happens, you know, very often with the artists. We've experienced that a number of times in the last couple of years, is to be loyal to people that were there early on for you, because that's often, for me, like, we're in a situation often where we're there early and we have seen with our eyes, not with our ears. Reward those that have seen your work for what it is, to the heart, not what it is to the pocket, you know. And I think that, like, for me, I'm like, you will start seeing, like, weirdos come around trying to get your work, trying to make an extra, you know, it's like they're just trying so hard to make some money around you. And that is a great problem to have, but that's also a very dangerous problem to have. And I think that, like, to focus on relationships that matter to you, and to focus on the advice of people coming from relationships that matter to you, is very important. And also, you know, to keep your head down and weather the storm. It is a storm when there's a lot of interest around your work. Don't let that become a stumbling block to the productivity in your studio, because again, without your studio practice running and without your mental well-being intact to continue a studio practice, then you don't have anything. You know, it's like you don't. So that's advice. Sorry, that was like really long-winded and roundabout.
It's okay. It's okay. So Monique, I mean, we're coming down to the last couple of minutes. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to give any closing thoughts that you have, you know, considering that the audience for today's talk is primarily made up of emerging artists, I'm sure. Sort of like navigating the way forward through these uncertain times.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. You know, one of the things that, you know, whether or not you get an MFA, you don't get taught about going and you know, being represented by a gallery in grad school. It's just not part of the curriculum. Like, you hear about it, you get it through osmosis or whatever. So, you know, it's not that difficult, but the information is not readily out there. And so I feel that, like, artists, especially young artists, need to arm themselves with as much information as possible, because they get themselves into situations where they're, you know, shipping their work off to Stockholm without a proper consignment form, and then they never get that work back, or they never get paid. And they, like, there's all of these safeguards that, you know, like, you want to make sure that, you know, you're agreeing to things, that you're asking about things, you are asking for things, because this art world does not exist without the artists. Like, that, they are the engine. We have no jobs without them. And artists often forget that they have the power to ask, and, like, asking it, like, for anything. The worst thing somebody could say is no, but, like, ask for what you think it's worth. And if something feels wonky, it probably is. And you know, there's too many times that artists have been duped, and I don't think that's ever going to go away. But there's plenty of on the level galleries that will will give you and arm you with the proper, paperwork and support. But I think it's just really like thinking it through and like what's important. Like your work has to safely get from point A to point B. And if it sells, you have to agree that this is what you're going to get and be paid within like 30 days of being paid, and that you are going to, be informed of where, like who bought the work and where it lives in the world. Because when you have that wonderful museum retrospective, 50 years from now, where to like go back and get that thing. And so like, a lot of these young artists are very enthusiastic, as they should be, about opportunities being presented to them. But you can't forget that there are business aspects, and there are, forms and things that are easily put in place to make sure that you're covered and your work is covered, and things are safely taken care of.
Thanks for that. And we're at 3 now. There have been questions that have been coming in the Q&A, and I think that we've answered most of them. Someone did want to know, Monique, if you're only based in Chicago. I believe the answer to that is yes.
We are only based in Chicago, but we've done, for 3 years, we've done pop-ups in New York on the Lower East Side, and we would consider doing that. But home base is Chicago, and I'm not going anywhere.
And Esther, you're both in Los Angeles and in Seoul, and those are the 2 cities that you're operating in. And David, you're in Detroit, Michigan. So David, I wanted to give you an opportunity as we close off here. Are there any closing thoughts that you also wanted to share?
Sure. We actually have 2 locations. I'm the Gagosian of Detroit. We're in Birmingham and Detroit. So, and we love having both locations. It's been wonderful. So I think artists really need to be careful going forward, because I don't know what the economics of having a gallery post-pandemic in major cities is going to be like. I can only imagine the overhead that people are confronting, and hopefully our dealers are doing well, but I think artists really need to be circumspect. I think they need to ask their artist friends, because people talk. If you stiff an artist, they're not going to keep that to themselves. They're going to talk about it. And I think dealers get reputations within the community. And I think artists should definitely talk to their friends about who they're thinking about approaching, and get the background information, definitely. And make sure they're dealing with somebody who's going to do everything that they say they're going to do. Most importantly, when they sell a work, to pay you in a timely fashion.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank all 3 of you for your insight today. This has been fun conversation for me. I hope it was fun for you. And I want to thank everyone who's joined us, and also thank you all for all the questions that came in. So wishing everyone a safe remainder of the day, and hoping I'll be seeing you all in person sometime very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dexter.
Thank you.
Hosting this.
Thank you.